All right, so before we start, I'll request everyone present here to please switch on their camera so it becomes an interactive session while we proceed ahead. Also, I like to inform everyone that we'll be recording this session for future reference. With that being said, good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking out your valuable time and making it here this Sunday afternoon for this insightful session. I am Anuj Bhatia, currently in my second year, and a member of the Legal Aid and Support Center's Communication and Collaborations Department. I am here as your moderator, and I'm really glad for this opportunity to moderate this distinguished guest lecture and Q&A session focusing on the growth of feminist jurisprudence and its impact on legal aid in India. Before we go ahead with the session, I'd like to give a brief introduction about our college and our committee, the Legal Aid and Support Center. The Kirit P. Mehta School of Law of SPKM's NMIMS was established in the year 2013 by the Bar Council of India, along with numerous committees constituted to promote practical application of the legal field as well as co-curricular activities. The Legal Aid and Support Center, established in 2018, plays a pivotal role in creating legal awareness and is extremely vocal about increasing access to justice. It offers hands-on experience in the legal field to the students of NMIMS Kirit P. Mehta School of Law. With various projects being conducted since its inception, the Project Cradle initiated by the committee is an initiative that has been working in the area of child protection with various extensive research projects conducted. The Cradle aims to operate a wide variety of programs related to child protection, including raising awareness of children's rights, the provision of legal aid to trafficked children, policy and legislative advocacy for legal frameworks relevant to child protection and research, which also includes monitoring and documentation. Further, the Legal Aid and Support Center has been officially recognized as a stakeholder coordinating with the United Nations Committee on Rights of Child. The Legal Aid Committee then had a series of extensive discussions, pitching of suggestions, and in the end, a consolidated and precisely drafted version of our comments on the general comment. The same was published and taken into formal consideration for the final version of UNCRC's general comment with a far-reaching global importance. In our stride towards ensuring access to justice, the Legal Aid Clinic has been collaborating with advocates and firms to ensure a pro bono network in order to help us provide legal advice and assistance to needy, alongside working on policy recommendations at structural levels. A very important aspect of access to justice is access to legal education. This is exactly what we aim to achieve today through today's guest lecture. Today's guest lecture is just the first part of what promises to be an exciting series of distinguished guest lectures in collaboration with eminent legal personalities not only in India but all over the world. Today's guest lecture is in collaboration with none other than senior advocate Aishwarya Bhati, who has indeed been a trailblazer in the field of law. The topic for the same is the growth of feminist jurisprudence and its impact on legal aid in India. Lastly, right before we begin the session, I have a few instructions which need to be mentioned. For this particular session, we'll be following the format where our honorable guest speaker, Ms. Aishwarya Bhati ma'am, delivers her lecture first course, while later the floor will be open to any questions that the audience may have. For the question to be addressed, the participants can use the hand raise feature, which will let them to unmute themselves and subsequently they can ask their questions. We'll be allowing participants in order of their hands raised. I'll request everyone to kindly maintain the decorum accordingly. Also, I'll request everyone to stick with us till the end, as we'll be sending the link to the feedback form in the chat box at the end of the session. Please be mindful of the fact the participants will fill the form will only be issued the due certificates for this session. With that being said, I'd like to invite our chairperson, Yashasvi Kanodia, who will be introducing our honorable guest speaker of this session, Ms. Aishwarya Bhati.
Thank you, Anuj, and good afternoon, everyone. It is nothing short of a pleasure to be able to introduce someone we all know of as a trailblazer litigator, someone who has broken all stereotypes and continues to do so every single day. Ms. Aishwarya Bhati is the youngest ever woman advocate to have been designated as a senior advocate by the Supreme Court of India. She also dons the title of the youngest ever Additional Solicitor General of India from the date of her appointment on 30th June 2020, only being the fourth woman ever to have occupied this coveted position. She has a distinguished professional standing of 22 years at the bar. She was also the former Additional Advocate General for the state of Uttar Pradesh in the Supreme Court from 2017 to 2020. She has been engaged in fighting for women's rights, children's rights, and has also led from the front the rights of women officers in all wings of the Indian military for permanent commission and commanding positions. Her work in the industry of issuing large pictorial warnings on tobacco-based products as well as her work on stronger tobacco regulations has been instrumental in reducing tobacco consumption. Her feats of excellence do not stop with her legal achievements. Coming from a defense background, ma'am boasts of other commendable achievements like having commanded the Rajasthan NCC contingent in the public day camp on Rajpath in 1994. She was also awarded the Cherry Blossom Award for the Best Turned Out Cadet. Ma'am is also a distinguished solo glider pilot, an exemplary shooter, and a trained horse rider. I think ma'am's list of achievements is long and I can go on, but people are waiting to hear from her. Today, ma'am will be talking about the evolution of feminist jurisprudence and its impact on legal aid in India. Over to you, ma'am.
US Constitution, which is supposed to be one of the oldest constitutions in the world, they claim to be one of the most developed democracies, a formidable, robust democracy, did not allow women to vote. And though it is, I mean, it's been 100 years, but let me tell you, it was only in the decades up to 50s, 60s, and even 70s that all the states of United States actually allowed voting to women. So universal adult franchise actually got materialized and realized much later. Switzerland is a country that we all have seen in Bollywood movies for sure. I mean, that's a country, it's a non-aligned country. I mean, the Swiss guards are the ones that guard the Vatican, and everyone knows as Switzerland is a measure of development and you attaining your liberties. It was in the decade of 70s that Switzerland allowed women to vote there. Now, let me give you one more perspective. I'm just giving you these two examples to so that we can appreciate the journey and how it has been. Rape was always considered, I mean, to start with, it had always been considered as an offense against the man. So it's funny, yeah, Khushi's raising her eyebrows, but that's how it was. So rape was considered an offense against the father of the girl if the girl was unmarried, and it was considered as an offense against the husband of the woman if the woman was married. Because the idea was that the woman is a property of her father or property and then passes on as a property of the husband. So it is an offense. It was considered to be the gravest form of property offense that one could inflict on anybody. And you will see that reasoning that one has seen in the, I mean, we just 3-4 years back that adultery judgment came. Joseph Shine, you all would have followed that one. The definition of adultery in the Indian Penal Code was that whoever has, sexual relationship, etc., with somebody's wife. Now, pay attention to the next line. Without the consent, connivance of the husband. So if you had consent or connivance from the husband, it was not adultery. If you did not have consent and connivance of the husband, then it was adultery. And this was precisely the reason why it did not sustain a constitutional challenge, and it was thrown out by a unanimous judgment. That judgment is a landmark judgment. It celebrates the dignity of a woman, how it has to be. It is, of course, the times changed. So in the last 60, 70 years, rape was not considered as an offense against property. 100 years maybe. It was considered as an offense against the dignity of a woman. But it took a very long time for that shift to happen. And if you look at the definition of adultery, you would say that Macaulay, when he made the IPC, how did he sustain this? Because it was based on that feudal patriarchal mindset. But interestingly, adultery was considered on 3 earlier occasions by the Indian Supreme Court, and to start with Bombay High Court, and then 2 occasions by the Indian Supreme Court after the coming of the Constitution. And on the earlier occasions, Bombay High Court to start with, and then the Supreme Court did not find anything wrong in that definition of adultery. So that is how adultery continued to be there. Now, I mean, as law students, one feels a little surprised also, as we are all students of law. You are students of law who study law. I am a student of law who practices law. But the interesting part is that why did the Supreme Court take so long? I mean, why did they take 70+ years to realize that the definition of adultery is so warped, it's against the dignity of a woman. They did not find anything wrong with it because they felt that this is in accordance with the times. It is okay. Woman can neither be an abettor, woman cannot be an instigator, she cannot be challenged there. Can it be an offense against the woman? Because adultery, as one understands a normal parlance, the definition of adultery is one of the spouses having an extramarital affair. So it should equally be, and that's how it is understood in matrimonial law. But for some reason, IPC definition continued. Now, voting was something that we took for granted because our constitution was a very progressive constitution, is a very progressive constitution. We did not have the problems that other countries dealt with. Our founding fathers made sure that we had the strong pillars and strong epitomes of justice, really strengthening the constitutional morality and the constitutional jurisprudence. So that is why you see our equality also, Article 14. And then it is immediately succeeded by Article 15, which specifically talks about affirmative action. So equal treatment of equals is the jurisprudence that we have. And that is how we have been able to have laws which are peculiar, special for women, for children, other marginalized sections, but we are talking about women and feminist jurisprudence. So that journey is important to understand that Article 15 allowed the state, in fact, mandated the state to take affirmative action to protect the rights of women so as to ensure that thousands of years of patriarchal feudal mindset had inflicted the kind of miseries and inequality on women. So you can't put them, I mean, they were not equal to start with. So you could not, the journey could not have taken off from an equal pedestal. Women needed that affirmative action to bring them at par. Now let's look at some of the, sorry, I took so long to give the introduction. I'm going to wind up. I'm just going to give my thoughts in the next 10 minutes, but I want this to be interactive. I'd specifically requested Khushi that we should make this more and more interactive. And I would like to also, learn from your ideas, your thoughts, your questions, your comments. So please, guys, be ready. I'm going to make this interactive in 10 minutes. But before that, let me give you a little perspective of the three silos, if we can speak about. The first silo is the personal rights and the personal dignity of a woman. The second silo would be crimes against women. And the third silo, I'm going to divide this for easy understanding. My mother taught me when I was a young girl, if you have very difficult spellings or very long words to remember and memorize their spellings, always break it down. So I have sort of taken that, and I always, whenever there is a long or a complex issue that we have to speak about, I feel that dividing it into small subheadings always helps me. So that's how I'm going to try and explain to you all also my thoughts on it. And the third aspect is workplace, rights of women in the workplace. So when, personal spaces, personal rights, personal dignity is a journey of the constitutional rights. I'm going to come there in a bit. But let me start from the criminal jurisprudence. The criminal jurisprudence has seen from the beginning, we saw. So I'm going to tell you some important judgments and some important provisions of law, because jurisprudence has seen change in law and also the judgments that have changed the face of that law. So to start with, IPC just had two specific offenses against women, rape and outraging the modesty of a woman. It took the criminal amendments of 2013. I mean, you would remember the Nirbhaya tsunami that got to our country, and we all stood up against the gruesome and the barbaric debauchery of a crime that it was. And that led to wide-scale criminal amendments. And those criminal amendments added offenses which were hitherto accepted in the society as minor aberrations or, innocuous things: eve teasing, voyeurism, sexual harassment, or, acid throwing. Acid throwing, of course, is a very heinous offense, but that got identified as a separate offense and on differing degrees only in 2013. Then there is a whole set of crimes which the woman was subjected to in the matrimony. You know, the dowry laws that were made in our country in the decades of 1970s were landmark because in India we used to see thousands and lakhs of young women being thrown into wells, you know, burning in the kitchen of the house, pesticide being found in her viscera, in the matrimonial home, in the four walls of the matrimonial home, where she has no protection, nobody to speak for her, nobody to come and give testimony. So nobody knows what happens to this woman. So this law, the amendments that were brought in, which are the dowry laws that were brought in, of course, the Dowry Prohibition Act came, and then amendments were made in the IPC and the Evidence Act. They're very significant amendments that were made. Because for the first time, now you all would have followed, our criminal jurisprudence follows the principle of proving a crime beyond the shadow of all reasonable doubt. That is the fulcrum of our criminal jurisprudence. So till you are proven guilty, you are innocent. And that jurisprudence gives a lot of latitude and leeway to the accused, because accused doesn't need to prove his case. Accused only needs to point one hole in the prosecution story, and he's entitled to acquittal on a benefit of doubt. But the dowry laws changed that jurisprudence upside down. It reversed that jurisprudence to say that if these 4 or 5 conditions are met, then, so let me tell you those 4 or 5 conditions. If a woman within 7 years of marriage dies in the matrimonial home under suspicious circumstances, so it's not a natural death, under suspicious circumstances, and if she has been subjected to cruelty in connection with the demand, it will be presumed to be a dowry death. So IPC amendments were made, evidence amendments were made to make a presumption of crime. And this was a very significant step because it reversed the entire criminal jurisprudence. Now we see a lot of these provisions under more heinous offenses, which are drug, NDPS offenses, MACOCA offenses, UAPA offenses, under the some of the predicate offenses under NIA Act, etc. Terrorist, activities, etc. So we see this change in jurisprudence that has, but dowry laws were one of the first few who got this reverse in jurisprudence, that this crime is so heinous and there is such less probability of availability of evidence that the presumption is in favor of the crime, and then the accused who are part of the matrimonial home, maybe husband, father-in-law, mother-in-law, whoever is in the matrimonial home and is accused, they have to establish their innocence. So this was a huge change, this change, and then we saw in more number of crimes being added, the definition of rape got amended. A lot of judgments came on this. Acid attack victims were specifically, this was a crime that was on the nudging of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court banned, Lakshmi versus Union of India, they banned the sale of acid across the counter because it was just so freely available. It was available for anyone who felt he was a jilted lover or a not respected spouse. He could just buy acid across the counter and throw it on the woman as if it was her property, as if it was his property. So these amendments were very instrumental in bringing about the change. Now, some procedural aspects of the crime. Time is short. I'm trying to just give a few examples. The topic is vast. I can't cover it all, but I'll give you some examples so that you appreciate the journey. On the procedural aspects also, the changes have been many. For example, a rape victim, there used to be a character assassination of a rape victim when she used to go for trial. It was adding insult to her injury. It was like rubbing salt on her wounds. When her testimony used to be recorded, her cross-examination, starting from the 2-finger test, that itself is a violation of the dignity. So see, the constitutional aspects go hand in hand. That's why I didn't start there, but all of these aspects really got into, the judgments were instrumental in making sure that the dignity of the woman has to be protected. That's why you see now where the rape laws are. I mean, and earlier there used to be arguments. There were arguments in the court that if it was a rape case being argued, that there was no penetration. Imagine that argument had to be made, and you had to establish that there was penetration, because that is what the old definition of IPC of rape under the IPC required. But under the new amendment, the definition has changed, and that definition has changed for the good. The Supreme Court in another judgment took away that distinction in age. So if you were, you know, if you were there was an exception that unless the woman is married to the man, to the accused, then even if she's a child, it doesn't matter. So that definition was, that distinction was done away with in another landmark judgment of Justice Lokur. POXO Act came in 2012. POXO Act was also a very landmark and a watershed moment in the jurisprudence of feminism for criminal law. See, why I'm putting so much attention and focus on criminal law is, societies, nations, we can't lower the standards or merits for women to come into these spaces and perform or, contribute. But it is the onus and full responsibility of the society and nation to ensure that the public and private spaces are available without a woman and a girl worrying about her safety and security. So crimes and, more number of crimes against women play a huge role in the kind of contribution that women make in that society. And I mean, look at our own country. If you see crimes against women, some of our, the northern states perform very poorly, because that feudal patriarchal mindset is still a very difficult proposition here. But I mean, you guys are in Bombay. You know how Bombay is. You know how Gujarat is. You know some of the states down south. There, women don't need to worry when they step out, in public spaces or at night, or coming back from home, etc. So there you see in those states, those societies, the contribution of women in all areas, in families as well as workplaces, is much higher. So that is a very important aspect. Now let me shift quickly to the workplace. The workplace, one of the earliest judgments in 1950s was when a particular rule of union government was challenged, because that rule required a woman employee to take permission from her employer if she was to get married. So this was a rule. I'm just taking you through the journey. 1950s, this was the rule, and this got challenged. And Supreme Court said, of course, they said that, you can't have, this is discriminatory, you can't have a rule like that. But apart from that, they did not interfere very much. So that is how you see Nargesh Mirza, the Air India judgment in the late 60s, early 70s. The judgment is from Supreme Court, where there was a prohibition on air hostesses. I mean, there was an embargo. If you get married, if you have children, sorry, you're not you can't be on the job. So, and that was an embargo just on women again. So that embargo got shifted. Another landmark judgment is Vishakha. Vishakha is of the decade of 1990s. It's a 1996 judgment. Vishakha was again in the background of a criminal, a crime, a heinous, brutal crime. You all would have followed this. It's a landmark judgment, but just in 2 or 3 lines, the facts were that this woman was a Sathin. The kind of Anganwadi workers that are there, that time they were called Sathins. She was from my state, Rajasthan. And she stopped some child marriages that were happening in an upper caste, upper community household in her village. It was her duty. Child marriages were banned. She had to do that. She stopped that. She complained. She got those marriages stopped. So as a revenge or a reward of her work, she was gang raped brutally. She was ravaged by the men of that family, because how dare this woman have the audacity to stop marriages that are happening in our family. When she went to, I was following that story. It shakes me every time. When she went to register the FIR, in Rajasthan, women wear these long flowy skirts. They're called ghagras or lehengas. The cops told her to open her ghagra in the police station because it was evidence. They did not bother to see that what the woman would, how will she protect her dignity to go back home? She narrates that she had to wrap the safa of her husband. So in Rajasthan rural areas, men wear this headgear, which is a very long piece of cloth which is tied in a turban on the head. She wrapped herself in the safa of her husband to walk back home from the police chowki where she had gone to report. Now, Vishaka was an NGO. Now, here comes the march of the legal aid. Vishaka was an NGO that brought up this case, and while the crime was being, was being prosecuted separately, this was Article 32 PIL filed by this NGO Vishaka, and they brought out that here, I mean, for doing her work, she's been, and that is how those guidelines were laid down by the Supreme Court to protect women from sexual harassment at workplace. And Supreme Court, it was a landmark judgment for many reasons. One important judgment, one important aspect was Supreme Court does not lay down law. It's not the job of the Supreme Court. The Constitution has separation of powers and, very clearly defined. So it's not Supreme Court's job to lay down law. It's the job of the legislature. Even if they test a law, the constitutionality of it, even if they strike it down, they don't lay down law. They send it back. Legislature has to lay down the law. But here, Supreme Court said, we can't turn a Nelson's eye to this. We can't turn a blind eye to this. We are going to lay down guidelines until the parliament makes a law on the aspect of protection of women from sexual harassment at workplaces. These guidelines will have the force of law. 96 judgment, when the act came, finally it came in 2013. From 96 to 2013. It took 17 years for the law to be brought in again by the legislature. But that has been the journey. Now you see there is a robust mechanism that is available. There are these, it's mandated by law for, to have these sexual harassment committees, one half of which should be women. It has to be headed by women, allowing more and more women to have the confidence, the wherewithal, and the security to. I must also mention the crimes that women have to endure in the four walls of home. Unfortunately, the data that comes out from NCRB year after year, that shows a very grim picture that out of all offenses, sexual offenses that happen against women, 50% or more than 50% of them happen in the coterie or four walls of places that are supposed to be protection places for women, places where, either they call home or, they are in protection homes or, places of confidence, places that are supposed to be a refuge, a shelter, where you can live, freely, fully. So this aspect, how this came to be covered. Now IPC had some sections, then along with dowry cruelty came to be added, section 498A in the IPC. But a landmark came in 2005, and that landmark was the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. That statute, in my view, is a watershed moment again for protection of women from the domestic violence. And this was not just for wives. This was for all women in a domestic relationship. So whether it's a mother, it's a sister, it's a mother-in-law, anybody, every woman who's live-in relationship. This says marriage or marriage-like or any other domestic relationship. So live-in relationship is also specifically covered under this act. And this act is also very, very interesting. The civil aspects of our matrimony, you all would know that unfortunately India still does not have a uniform civil code. And it's actually the matrimonial rights, succession rights. These are the two areas where we are governed by our personal laws, which are religion specific, which are not gender neutral, which continue to treat women as chattel. There is a little foray made into these laws, but largely this is an area of huge problem, because if women do not have rights in their homes, in their households, then it is going to be an extremely difficult next steps that we are going to take forward. So just a brief outline on that. Shah Banu's judgment was a judgment of the 1970s, where maintenance was added as a CRPC remedy under section 125 of CRPC. Now, criminal code, we must thank the British for this. They made sure that the country had a uniform and a common criminal code. And irrespective of gender, irrespective of religion, we are all governed by that uniform criminal code. So when maintenance was brought in CRPC section 125, Shah Bano, who had been a mother of 5 children, married for 40 years, she went to court for maintenance, her personal law which did not permit, but now because it was provided in CRPC, she had a right. It was opposed tooth and nail, but Supreme Court came down heavily and said nothing doing. A Muslim woman also has the right under the CRPC for maintenance. But you know what happened after that landmark judgment? The government of the day brought in a law to take away the fruit of the benefit that was available. So that law is very interesting. It is called Protection of Muslim Women at the Time of Divorce, but it actually takes away the protection that was granted. And it says that, well, husband's liability won't be there if there is other people in the family who inherit from her, they will give her, otherwise the Waqf board will take care, but essentially, negating her right completely to what was provided. Succession is one area where Supreme Court judgments have been instrumental. Women had no right to property prior to Constitution. Their rights to property were very, very limited. We are still governed by our personal laws. There have been a lot of reforms that have happened in the Hindu laws. The other laws still need to be reformed at a much greater scale. And we need to have these uniform laws for which are, otherwise they should all be made gender neutral. Even if we want to, as a country, keep personal laws, so all people of that religion, then it should not be gender specific. Everyone has the same law. That is what is going to pinch. Anyways, that is how things are. But now, just to, of course, I've given you this, but I have to link it to the legal aid. So 1987 was when the Legal Services Authorities Act was formulated. You are aware of the Constitution, the directive principles mandated. It's that the state must ensure and provide free legal aid to all citizens. But that came to be implemented in 1987 when this law was brought in. Now, this law is very interesting. It allows people who do not have the economic or the social wherewithal to battle or fight their cases. They have equal access to justice, to ensure that they have equal access to justice. So for everybody, they have to satisfy that minimum economic threshold to get a legal aid, to be entitled to free legal aid. But for women, irrespective of her economic capacity, she is entitled to free legal aid for protection of all her rights. And let me tell you, legal aid has been a moment that has given so much of impetus to the female jurisprudence, the feminist jurisprudence, because just yesterday we had this function at Vigyan Bhavan, inaugurated by the Honorable President. NALSA, which is the National Legal Services Authority, the chairman, executing chairman is the second senior most judge of the Supreme Court. Patron in chief is the Chief Justice of India always. And then every high court has a state legal services authority. Again, I mean, you have a legal aid clinic, so you know how it works. It is mandated by Bar Council of India for law colleges to have. But let me tell you, in my experience, I have not seen too many law colleges having a alive and vibrant legal aid clinic. So it's good to see that your college has a thriving legal aid clinic. It is important for us to realize that we have a responsibility to the community that we are in, and that community, whatever, and law students play a very important role, because there are a lot of lawyers who are pro bono volunteering for that legal work. But the problem is, yesterday, the data that was given by Justice Lalit, who's the executive chairman of NALSA in that function, he said, out of all the litigation that happens in the country, only 1% comes through legal aid. That is abysmal figure. So we have to have more and more people having access to that access to justice that for violation of their rights. And that is where law students can come in. Outreach programs, becoming that link, becoming that bridge between the people who need legal aid and the lawyers and the legal community. You have reached to lawyers in all courts. You can reach out through your institutes, through personally. But those people who need the access to justice the more, so they don't have, so that link is missing. And that is the biggest role that the law colleges and your legal aid clinics can perform. And I wish you all the best, all the Godspeed, God's strength, so that you can become, have that robust mechanism available with you. More so on women's rights, on feminist jurisprudence, the role of legal aid is extremely critical, because like I said, that data of 50%, when the protectors turn predators, it's not easy to speak about it. You would have seen that ad, that you hear from a household. There is an advertisement. It's a very telling advertisement. It's a legal aid advertisement that um, you hear the cries of a woman. Apparently, she's being battered and she's being brutally beaten up inside the house. So the neighbor just goes and knocks on the door. That is all, and it stops. So somebody is there. Or you would have seen, that going to a restaurant, the woman is so intimidated. The guy who's serving there, the server passes a chit. Is it all right? Are you comfortable? That is still the reality of our nation, that not just our nation, the whole world. We still need to have that special, that extra, extra mile that we need to go to make sure that women and their rights are not violated, and we are able to reach out to them. I'm sorry, a lot remains. I overshot my time, but let's start with the questions, remarks, or any interaction that you all would like to have. I have a lot to speak, but I want to make it interactive.
Sure, ma'am. So with that, the ma'am's presentation has come to an end. So as we started our session on a very high note, I'll request everyone to switch on the camera so that we can take a picture together to capture this amazing moment. So we can go ahead with the picture. I'll give a short countdown. I'll request him to switch on the cameras once again.
Yeah, you must say cheese.
So yeah, I'll begin my countdown. Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Got it.
Okay, thank you so much. Uh, so as mentioned, next I'd like to call upon the Q&A session with ma'am, where participants can come up with any question or doubts regarding the session. As mentioned, you could use the hand raise feature for asking your respective questions, and you'll be unmuted consequently, and you can ask your further questions. So we can begin up with the Q&A session. So first, I can see Drishti Bhatia's hand raise. I'll just unmute her.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
So, ma'am, my question was twofold. Basically, I had two different questions. Firstly, in the present times, we have so much knowledge. There's so much literature available on criminalizing marital rape. So, but why is it that the legislature or the judiciary has not taken a step ahead, or what are the impediments in criminalizing marital rape? That's my first question. And my second question is that even after we have robust legislation in place, we have these rape laws amended, we have all of this legislature somewhat in place. But what is the loophole in the execution and the implementation that the crime rates against women are not coming down, or they are still, the situation is still a little grim in India?
So I'm going to answer your second question first, because I think that really puts a finger on the nerve of the topic as to why, despite such such progressive and reformative constitutional provisions, laws, judgments, there is very little difference that one sees on the ground. I mean, the difference is, of course, there. That's why I took you from the beginning of the journey. I mean, not really beginning, but took you through the journey a little so that one could appreciate. Oftentimes when we are in the moment, we are here, so we can't appreciate how it was 20 years back, 40 years back, 50 years back. So we have to look from that perspective. But in my opinion, no amount of laws, no amount of reformative outlook is going to make a change till things change in our homes. So it has to start from home. It has to start from us treating our daughters on the same pedestal, our mothers on the same pedestal. Women of our family have to be given the same latitude, the same liberty. Young girls have to be allowed to have the freedom to choose what they want to choose. So when, even today, today women have broken really all barriers. If you look at workplaces, they've broken all barriers. There's not a single field that women have left untouched. But these are women, if you will notice, these are women who have got a lot of strength and support from their families, or some pivotal people in their homes, maybe immediate family, larger family. But if you clip the wings of young girls in the household at home, how do you expect her to take a flight outside? See, so you can't have, in workplaces, in all these areas, you can't have lower measures. If I'm a woman lawyer, I can't expect that I'll get an order even if I've not prepared my brief well. And I can't prepare my brief well unless I have a strong support system, a robust mechanism which allows me the liberty to spend the hours that I am required to spend on preparation of files when I go to argue. So I think the real change is going, because none of us take it seriously. Of course, the governmental role, the law enforcement agencies' role, that is pivotal. But there is no sensitivity. Our laws are amongst the best laws in the world. We lack in implementation, because the sensitivity that you see, even of the law enforcement mechanism, if they're on a VIP duty, you look with so much of alacrity they are attending to those duties. But if it is somebody has gone to report a missing girl request, वो बैठा के रखेगा, वो पहले किसी और का मिसिंग कुत्ते की रिपोर्ट आएगी, वो पहले लिखेगा, उसके बाद में वो आपको पूछेगा कि वो किसके साथ गई, उसका कोई दोस्त तो नहीं है, उसका कोई अफेयर तो नहीं है, उसका कोई बॉयफ्रेंड, अरे दैट गर्ल इज मिसिंग, somebody attend to that. So that sensitivity is lacking, that seriousness is lacking. But the real change will really happen when all of us change at our homes together. And this is going to take time, because this is not a change that can happen overnight. This is a change that is going to take, this is a, not an incremental change. It is a reformative change. And change is happening, but it is too slow right now. It needs to happen faster than what it is happening. Now, the second question that you put was with regard to marital rape. I feel that it's a misnomer that marital rape is not a criminal offense. I was mentioning the Domestic Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act of 2005. It defines sexual violence, sexual abuse also. And sexual abuse is actionable as a matrimonial wrong. It is actionable as a wrong under the Domestic Violence Act. And interestingly, though it is a matrimonial thing, but domestic violence is a hybrid law. It's a very interesting law because it has elements of civil law and criminal law. So to start with, now this is also very interesting. This really gives a lot of succor to the hapless victims, because if a law is only a criminal law, then there is only a punishment that is there. There is really no restitution to the victim. But if a law is only civil law, it gets mired in that personal laws issue. That civil law you can't implement across board to all women. So this is made as a hybrid law. To start with, it is civil wrongs, civil remedies that are prescribed. You can get protection orders, maintenance orders, custody orders, the household, shared household, etc. All those orders you can get. And if those orders are violated, then it becomes a penal, actionable offense, having the characteristic of a criminal law. So this is available to all. The only area really of where the marital rape is not made as an offense is under the exception in section 375 of IPC, because there is an exception that under the general rape, that the woman cannot bring a case against her husband. But that you say a lot of literature is available, a lot of awareness is available. Yes, that is right. It is available. That is the direction that we need to be headed it to, and we are headed in that direction. But let me give you an example. I mean, we are standing on a flight of stairs. We want to go to the roof. We want to reach there, but we can't catapult to the roof. We will have to go through the steps. Look at the state of our matrimonies today. In the name of not having a uniform civil code, civil relationship is not only between a husband and wife, between employer employee, between colleagues, between your workmen, between how we construct homes, how we pay electricity, taxation, telephone connections, how we walk on the road. These are all civil relationships. But these civil relationships are all governed by gender neutral and religion neutral laws. But the relationship of a husband and wife, these religious contractors, that is what I like to call them, who oppose giving rights to women in matrimony, equal rights to women in matrimony, in the name of opposing uniform civil code. So that is the reality of our country today. Today, still we have problems of dowry deaths. In the heartlands of our country, our daughters are still being burnt in their village, in the kitchens. And I mean, it's very surprising. You never hear of a mother-in-law getting burnt in a kitchen. It is always the daughter-in-law who gets. Why? Mother-in-law also cooks. But it's always the daughter-in-law. So there's a very long journey for us to take. I mean, we have to get to, and why get to just marital rape? We have to go to a definition of a time where rape becomes gender neutral. Young boys are ravaged. That is actionable under POCSO Act since 2012. But there was no remedy available for that till 2012. POCSO Act came when, sexual offenses against children became gender neutral. So that is the direction where we need to go. Sexual harassment has become a reality, minuscule minority, but it has become a reality where women are coming in position of power. So there's a lot of hue and cry about that. Men want these laws to become gender neutral. So we should head in that direction. But it's a progression. It's a march. I don't think as a nation we can jump the loops. These are loops that we need to go through. That's my opinion.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so moving on to the next question, we have Himan Malik for the next question. Also, I like to mention that due to the paucity of times, we'll just take one or two more questions. I'm really sorry for the inconvenience.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, moderator, for providing me with such an opportunity. Ma'am, so my question is that, for example, there are provisions within the Indian Evidence Act, for example, Section 119, which allows the court to communicate with the witness in whatever means or manners he's very comfortable in, so that he can give his testimony, right? So my question to you basically is that should there be a checklist of items that the courts should have which suits a woman aggrieved, and how such checklist should be followed by the court so that they do not discriminate against women litigants who are illiterate or belong to different caste or religion?
So Himang, that's your name, right? So let me tell you, Himang, there are in tune with the provisions of the Evidence Act, there are a lot of statutory mechanisms that have been put in place. There is a vulnerable witness protection program. There are these special rooms that have been created. There is provision for in-camera proceedings. There are already these guidelines that have been framed, but the latitude and liberty of applying those guidelines are with the presiding officer of the court. And that has been kept in a manner because you can't have a one size fit all formula. It will have to be on the basis of the vulnerability or the level of understanding. In fact, if you see the POCSO Act, there is a whole chapter on how the evidence has to be recorded, because these are all child victims. So there is provision for interpreters, there is provision for child counselors. There is a mandate that you have to allow somebody who the child feels comfortable in. So most of these witness evidence is recorded in the presence of the mother of the child or the father of the child, where they feel safe and secure. In camera proceedings allow that, you know, these statements are recorded without the glare of public scrutiny. So there is no media available there. There is, can I be heard? Yeah. Okay. In the POXO Act, interestingly, there is a provision which says that the accused should not be in the sight of the victim when her testimony is being recorded, his or her. POXO victim could be a boy or a girl, both. So accused should not be in the sight. Accused lawyer cannot cross-examine the POXO victim. Whatever, but I mean, for a fair trial, you need to have a cross-examination. So what happens is, the provision is that the accused lawyer can put the questions to the judge, that these are my questions, and the judge asks in a manner which is not intimidating. So these provisions are there, and they are actually making the provision very, very, you know, allowing this to become a more humane process, so that, you know, the whole agony of going through the justice delivery mechanism is minimized as much as possible. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind that these are competing rights. On one side is the victim's right to justice, on the other side is the accused right of a fair trial. So both have to be balanced in the criminal jurisprudence, and that is why the last word is really of the presiding officer. It's a judicial order. It can be challenged in a higher court. In fact, one of my cases we brought, and it was again through a legal aid. Most of the cases that I have done, which have become, you know, memorable and important cases in feminist jurisprudence for me, have been cases that I got marked to do as a legal aid lawyer. I'm very proud to say that I have been a legal aid volunteer lawyer from the beginning of my career. I mean, right now in my position, I am on the executive committee of the Supreme Court Legal Services Authority, but I've been always a volunteer lawyer. And one such case that I was doing was this girl, she was, though her biological age was about 36, 37, but she was suffering from mental cerebral palsy since birth. So her mental age was only about 5, 6 years of age. So we tried to bring in that case through POXO to say that don't look at just the biological age, look at the mental age of the victim and let it be under the procedure of POXO. And there, the mother was really prosecuting this case because obviously the victim was not in a position to assert her rights and vindicate her rights. So the whole concern of the mother was that she is not in a position to testify. And POXO courts are like child-friendly courts. You are not there with hardened criminals. So the whole atmosphere of the court is not very intimidating to the victims. So we wanted to bring it in under the that whole provision. Of course, the court did not agree with our argument of taking mental age. They said it's for the legislator to decide. But there were directions that were passed with regard to treating her as a vulnerable victim and, you know, making sure that she has all the protection that is available in that program for when her testimony is recorded. I mean, it became an irony. I have to मैं ending नहीं बताऊंगी तो ending का interest खत्म हो जाएगा. But irony or providential justice was that when the matter was pending before Supreme Court, the victim, the accused died in jail. So that is how that matter went on.
I hope that clears your question. So the last question which will be attending is from Tejas Channa. You can go ahead with that question.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes.
So I wanted to ask about the pendency of cases in the courts, because with the Nirbhaya case that happened after 8 long years, the justice was given. So it opens up a debate whether the fairness should be there in the trials, because all the remedies were exhausted till the end. Or should the victim wait till the end? Because Nirbhaya died in 2012 and the justice was given in 2020. So that is my question. And I have another question on POCSO. The amendment also allows minors and juveniles to be tried till the age of 16, under 18 or till 16. But what about under 16? Because can we still argue can we still argue incapability of committing crimes? Because there are cases where even a 13-year-old child rapes a woman or a girl. So
Okay, Tejas, I'm going to try and answer your questions in brief. I think we will need to have one more session for this topic. That there is so much of more interaction that needs to happen. But what was your first question? Sorry. Let me answer the second. Okay,
the
pendency.
pendency of cases
All
was the
right, got
first
it.
one.
Sorry. So on the issue of pendency, let me tell you, in the decade of 1980s, one of the lectures that Nani Palkiwala, doyen of the bar, I will recommend all of you young law students to read some of these biographies of people who have been instrumental in the journey of the constitutional principles in our country. Their biographies are very telling, and I have gotten moved and inspired. So I read in his one of the lectures compilation that he was giving a lecture, I think in Canada, and he said that uh, the closest thing to infinity is a lawsuit in India. That's the definition of infinity. Unfortunately, the problem has only become more and more with our population explosion, with our resources falling short for everything. Actually, today the position is that the delay is eating up our system as you know, like termites. I mean, on the edifice of it, it's a beautiful structure. Our constitutional judgments are celebrated across the world. I mean, people laugh sometimes at the U.S. Supreme Court, what they did with that what they did with that heartbeat law of Texas. They threw it out on a technicality that there's no opposite side. I mean, if that case, I'm 100% certain that if that case would have come to Indian Supreme Court, they would have thrown it out. They would have quashed it on this ground alone. That how can you outsource a sovereign function? So the US Supreme Court did not interfere. Sorry, I find this very baffling, so I have to share with you. US Supreme Court did not interfere in that on this ground that there is no other side. Because here the Heartbeat Act made the action to be done by private individuals. The state does not bring a law against the woman or her aides who have undertaken that abortion as soon as the heartbeat of the fetus can be heard. So there's no other side. So we can't hear the matter because there's only one side. State is not the other side. And on that, and here, if it would have been there, I'm telling you, it would have been quashed on this point that how can you outsource sovereign functions? And what about the dignity of the woman? I mean, the US is today debating about the choice to wear a mask, the choice not to take vaccine, the choice to roam about your life in the manner that you want. What about the choice of the woman? And the US Supreme Court does not see it. But leave that as it may. I'm really agitated about that issue. I wanted to bring it up. It came to my mind. But Indian Supreme Court judgments are respected across the world. You know, they are quoted, they're taken reference from, and you know, across the world. But this whole edifice of our constitutional jurisprudence is decaying because of the delays that are happening. You are saying Nirbhaya took time? Nirbhaya was a fast-tracked case. It was fast-tracked because of so much of media attention and so much of outrage that, you know, the whole country felt for that. There are thousands and lakhs of Nirbhayas who are still waiting for justice, Tejas. That, unfortunately, is the reality. While Nirbhayas continue to happen, there are Nirbhayas from before. I am dealing with many matters. On Tuesday, I have a death sentence case where this young girl who was returning home from college somewhere in the somewhere Delhi ka case hai, and three girls were walking. A car came, stopped next to these three girls, pulled the girl who was outermost, pulled the girl inside the car. They took her to some village in Haryana, ravaged her, brutalized her like anything. And the matter is pending, and it's a death sentence case, and it is yet the appeal is to be heard before the Supreme Court. So the difficulty, and it's I mean, obviously you get outraged, but then the system is, and let me also tell you the other side of it. The judges of the Indian judiciary, right from the, threshold judiciary, from the grassroots judiciary, right up to our constitutional courts, right up to our Supreme Court, Indian judges are amongst the most hardworking judges in the world. The US Supreme Court does जितना काम वो पूरे साल में करते हैं, इंडिया की सुप्रीम कोर्ट एक दिन में करती है, if you take all the benches together. So that is the volume of the work that is there. It is a lot of hard work that goes in. Our population is too much. Our resources are not enough. They are always falling short. But we are reaching at that, what's that explosion. Before you get to the explosion, we are reaching that pivotal tipping point of delays in our system. We need to all put our heads together, do whatever it takes, because we can't allow our criminal cases, our civil cases to continue to remain synonymous with with infinity. कि केस हुआ, उसकी next generation, तीसरी generation कर रही है. So that is, but we'll need a full topic on this, Tejas. It can't be, we can't do justice to this but I've given you some perspective. On the amendments, that amendment is in the Juvenile Justice Act. Of course, read with POCSO Act, but Juvenile Justice Act ka amendment had to be brought in because of Nirbhaya. But there is a little caution and a slippery slope if we take this too far. Actually, whenever you will read IPC, the general exceptions chapter in the IPC, I think it's section 82, or I may be wrong in the section, but in that chapter there is a general exception of age. And that IPC, even in that time, that they had prescribed that up to 8 years of age, complete immunity. Then 8 to 12 years of age, on the court will decide limited culpability. And then 12 onwards, the culpability is also again looking at the mental aptitude and his ability to understand the nature or the gravity of the crime and the consequence of his action. See, crime is based on mens rea. So that mens rea, the law presumes that the child is not capable of that mens rea. And therefore, it's very dangerous to go down that path. There are international conventions, international treaties, which make it mandatory. In fact, India is in contravention of treaty by this amendment that we did, by allowing that latitude available, that if it's a heinous offense up to 16 years of age and above, the judge will have that liberty to see what was the mental capacity and mental aptitude of the offender, the victim. But there are a lot of petty offenses. This age, it's medical science. It's not really legal science that you and I can understand very well. But the medical experts world over say that the growing up, the hormonal changes, etc. Children, it's chemistry. It's a volatile age to be in, and that volatile age, if some offenses are happening which may not be, in consonance with the criminal justice system of that country, then also you have to allow the minor. So it's not like they go scot-free. They are kept in correction homes. There is provision of imprisonment for up to 3 years. There are other, fines and punishments that can be imposed, correctional measures that are to be done, because ultimately it is seen as the duty of the state to ensure that, even if children are coming from troubled homes and getting into these offenses, state has to ensure that the child gets the right upbringing, the right, way forward in way of correctional homes. So it's a delicate and a sensitive topic, but I don't think we can go any lower than 16. We have to keep in mind the state of mind of children and have them. And that is why you see that their crimes are not even recorded. So a juvenile in conflict with law, that's what they're called. They're not called accused and offenders. They're called juveniles in conflict with law. You can't, and after they become major, you can't have, the record cannot reflect that about their petty offenses that they would have committed as minors. There's a balance always that needs to be drawn.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope that clears your question. So with that, we'll have to end our Q&A session right here. So that being said, I'd like to invite our Honorable Dean, Dr. Alok Mishra, who is one of the most distinguished people you'll come across. His expertise in constitutional law is indeed unparalleled. His endeavors in supporting the Legal Aid Committee have led us to where we are today, and I'd like to thank him for joining us. With that, I'd like to invite Dean Sir for a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Anuj, and I'm very thankful. I didn't have a question, but an observation and also vote of thanks. I'm very sure that with the wonderful and very forceful talk of Madam Aishwarya Bhati, Honorable Solicitor General of India, Additional Solicitor General, and also she has been with our Supreme Court Bar Association as secretary of that, and a brilliant lawyer, in fact, a young lawyer, and the enthusiasm which Legal Aid Clinic and the volunteers of it, members of it, dynamic and young faculty members will have, that will go a long way. And such a balanced lecture is very difficult to be heard in life. And I got reminded of my own student days when I was studying in Campus Law Center of Delhi University way back in 1986. And then 87 came and the Rala incident took place in Rajasthan. And then when there was no Human Rights Commission, in fact, in India, at that time, in the guidance of Professor B.B. Pandey, Professor Pen Bakshi, we constituted something like a startup, a human rights organization in Delhi University. And then the first vitriolage case in India, which got reflected in media, Anshu Saxena's case was taken up. And then we also worked a lot, in fact, on various aspects of awareness. In fact, we didn't have that kind of legal aid cell at that time. But I'm very sure that the journey in such a short time, which Madam gave, right from 1970s, the laws changing, and then Shah Bano judgment, and followed by the need of uniform civil code, on which I had the privilege of doing PhD on the feasibility of uniform civil code in India, and also with regard to the famous judgment of Justice Markandeya Karju, as he was then as judge of Allahabad High Court in Maya Prakash case, declaring Section 9 of Hindu Marriages Act as unconstitutional. That a woman is not a property, and Section 9 cannot serve as a ground for seeking divorce or manipulating a ground for divorce. So something like that. And of course, the judgment was a far-reaching one jurisprudentially and may come up again as a majority view sometime. But right now, Saroj Rani's judgment is the majority law, law of the land, in fact. So many instances, wonderful illustrations, so many case laws, it's very difficult to sum up in such a way, at such a high level of discourse, and that also in such a simple way to be appreciated by students. I'm very, very thankful to you, Madam, for sparing your time on this Sunday afternoon and blessing our students of Kirit P. Mehta School of Law, which is the nodal law school of legal studies and research of NMIMS deemed to be university with national headquarters in Bombay, Vile Parle West. And this university, in fact, is a tier 1 university of the country amongst the 20 universities declared by Ministry of Human Resources Development, or SWILE, of Government of India. And we have 6-7 law schools, in fact, in all. Our law school is the nodal law school. We're doing hand-holding with other campuses of NMIMS, where law schools are located in Navi Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chandigarh, Dhule, and Indore. And we may have a law school maybe commissioned in 2024 in Noida. That will be North India campus of NMIMS. Qualitatively, we have taken care of 4 areas of law, as well as the present areas or developing areas of law in the light of developments of technology which are taking place with regard to artificial intelligence, blockchains, cloud computing, data analytics, and mobility laws, social media laws also. And I feel privileged of informing you that our students in UG level are studying all these areas of law, in fact, innovative areas of law also in their syllabi. So a blending of present and core areas and developing areas. And students are also from across the India, from most of the states through the channels of CLAT, LSAT, and NMIMS law aptitude tests. And also, like students have done, they have reached to the levels of semi-finals in Philip Jessup moot court competition in after qualifying the Asia rounds. So they are doing well. I'm very happy, and congratulations to Legal Aid Clinic and Legal Aid Support Center of the Law School and all the faculty members and the students associated with Legal Aid Cell and all the participants in program. Thank you so much, madam, for being with us this afternoon once again, and may God bless you. Wish you a very, very successful career ahead in life. Wherever you are, you will shine like this only. Thank you so much. Thank you, madam. Over to the anchor.
Thank you very much, sir. It's very kind of you to take out time and be with us through the entire lecture. It's indeed a privilege for me to be here, and I must assure your legal aid clinic and the volunteers that if any time, I mean, please become the outreach for legal aid program. A lot of focus, a lot of money is going into this to ensure that constitutional guarantees are there. And if you find anybody needs help at the Supreme Court level from the Legal Aid Committee of Supreme Court, please feel free to reach out to me. I will be happy to help if the matter has to come to Supreme Court. Other courts, I'm sure you will be able to find other lawyers, but please become that outreach. Please become that bridge that is required. Become that harbinger that the citizens require. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So lastly, I'd like to invite our Vice Chairperson, Virali, to conclude this session.
A very good afternoon. I hope I'm audible. I would just like to take another 2 minutes to firstly thank Ashwarya Bhati ma'am for imparting her abundant wisdom to all of us present in this meeting today. And I would also like to thank all the participants of this meeting for being so inquisitive and for being so active and engaging in this discussion today. I would like to thank our respected Dean, Dr. Alok Mishra, for gracing this occasion with his presence. And I would like to also thank Assistant Dean Sohini Srivastav, ma'am, for her constant support and guidance. I would also like to thank Dr. Rakesh Nambiar, our area chairperson for student events. And I'd like to thank Dr. Nazima Munshi ma'am and Ms. Afreen Khan for being such inspiring visionaries and the faculty conveners for the Legal Aid and Support Center. Last but definitely not the least, I would like to thank the core committee of the Legal Aid and Support Center of Kirit P. Mehta School of Law for organizing this and giving us a wonderful platform for engaging in this conversation today. And I would like to thank Anuj for moderating the session so well. I hope everyone over here has a great Sunday ahead and please stay safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
So with that, before ending the session, I'll just like to remind everyone that that the feedback form has been posted in the chat box. I'll request everyone to please fill in as as it is mandatory to avail the session's participation certificates. Thanks a lot.